I'm showing you how I sewed Elijah this varsity style hoodie here, which is in our team's football colours. But before we get into that, let's see the bloopers. Oopsie, wrong way. I'll wait for you to finish yawning. And we're already going rogue. It's chewing my fabric. Oh, so close. Wrong seam allowance. Hi crafty people! Today I'm showing you how I sewed this varsity style jumper for Elijah. It's a hoodie using a pattern from Peekaboo Pattern Shop. I'll link the pattern down below. And I specifically designed it using our football team's colours in mind. We love watching Australian rules football here in this family, and we barrack for the Adelaide Crows, so that is the team that we're supporting using this jumper. And I specifically made this for Elijah because our family was going to a game of the Crows playing, and they won, didn't they?
Yes, against a very hard team.
Yeah. Our family went to a footy game at Adelaide Oval recently, and Elijah was able to wear this jumper here, so that's what I made it for, and Elijah will be able to wear it for the rest of the football season as well. This pattern has a lined hood and is also lined on the inside as well, and it's really nice and cozy. I've made it out of polar fleece, so it's really quite warm for you, isn't it, buddy? Yeah. If this is your first time on my channel, then welcome. My name is Marie, and Elijah is the oldest of my 4 children who I love to sew different projects for. I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel if you want to see more of the different things that we make for our family, but with all of that being said, let's get making.
My mum makes a zip-up hoodie.
We're going to start the making process of this hoodie by first talking about the pattern sizing and which size you should pick. Elijah here is wearing a size 5 jumper, and I based that off of his chest measurements, measuring it against what the pattern recommended. He is 7 years old, so making a size 5 did seem like it was going to be too small, but it is a fairly good fit on him. The only problem was
The sleeves.
the sleeves. I made the size 5 sleeves, which was a mistake. You can probably see there on the camera. So even though the sleeves were too short, the body of the jumper wasn't too short. So I would say just keep that in mind if you are making this for a taller kid. You probably don't need to lengthen the body of the jumper too much, I wouldn't think, but you will need to probably lengthen the sleeves. So once I determined that I wanted to make a size 5 for Elijah, I then made the lining first because I wanted to test the size 5 and see if it would suit him. So I cut out my front and back pattern pieces for the lining only, but I did something slightly different. The logo here on Elijah's jumper is really quite large. If you spin around for me, buddy, just slowly. It's quite a large logo, and because of that, I knew it would get cut off a lot if I had too many seams. So I've actually made it just continuous here. You can turn to the side for me, buddy. Where there is no side seam here. So instead of cutting 2 front panels and 1 back panel on the fold, I've joined them all together and cut them in one continuous piece, basically from zip all the way around the back to the other side of the zip. And that way it meant that I wasn't cutting off too many of our logos if you just continues turning. Yeah. So that way it was a continuous pattern the entire way around the jumper. I changed to a stretch needle and a stretch stitch, and then I sewed the shoulder seams together, but I didn't need to sew the side seams because of the way I cut this pattern piece. So I tried this lining version on Elijah in a size 5 and it did fit him. So now I'm going to cut out the rest of the pieces in a size 5 as well. To cut out the main fabric piece for the body of this jumper, I first positioned the front of the jumper where I wanted it, keeping in mind where the position of the logo was. And then I put the back piece right next to it, and I overlapped them slightly to take into account that I didn't need the seam allowance between those 2 pattern pieces. Then I folded my fabric along the back piece, which was the fold line. And when you cut out both of the pieces together, that creates the whole jumper shape as if you had already sewn the side seams in. Then I cut out my 4 hood pieces and my 2 sleeve pieces, and just stay tuned because later on in this video I'm going to explain how I'm going to rectify the problem I had with the sizing for the sleeves. I'm not cutting out any of the binding for the wrist cuffs or the bottom of the jumper yet. I'll do that when we get to that step. My machine was already threaded with the yellow thread from the lining, so I figured I might as well just sew down the sleeve side seams while I had that all set and ready to go. So I did that first before moving on to then cutting out the patch pockets, and I carefully cut the pattern pieces out for the pockets so that they matched where the logo was on the backing fabric as well, so that when the pockets were sewn on there was consistency of the logo across the jumper. I sewed the diagonal edge of the pocket down, which is the part where you put your hand in, and then once you place it back onto your pattern piece, you can fold the top and side of the pocket down so that you can make a little seam allowance there and sew them, top stitching them onto the jumper itself. Next, I sewed the shoulder seams together like we did on the lining piece, before I was ready to move on to the band around the bottom of the jumper. My ribbing wasn't incredibly stretchy, so I ended up making mine longer than what the pattern recommended. And then you match up the edge of the ribbing with the edge of the jumper and pin it together, stretching it so that it makes it evenly stretched the whole way across. And then you sew about 3 inches on either side of this binding with a big gap in the middle, which we'll close over once we finish sewing in the zip. The zip gets sewn in face down on one side of the jumper, where you also need to align the bottom of the zip with the halfway point of that binding on the bottom, keeping in mind also that you need to allow for the seam allowance on the bottom part of that binding as well. Once you've sewn down one side, you then need to align it onto the other side of the jumper as well. I like to zip up my jumper on both sides and make sure that it is fitting correctly so that it is aligning the bottom and the top and everything's all pulled nicely, especially because it's a stretchy fabric. You don't want to be sewing it a bit wonky and then it not line up perfectly once it's done. The lining gets attached to the binding at the bottom in the same way as we attached the main fabric piece to it. And then we're folding the binding at the bottom in half and matching up the lining piece with our main fabric piece and sewing it down along the zip side on both sides of the jumper. Next, you push the binding up inside the jumper so that you can sew the bottom of the binding to each other in that big long gap that we left from before. I wish for this step that I'd put a marker where the center of the back, the center of the lining and the center of this band were so that I could easily line this up, because now that they're all like this, it's just a lot of layers to be fiddling around with. So if I make it again, and if you make this pattern, I would recommend you have a marker there where the center of each of those is. Pin along the bottom edge of the jumper, and we're sewing it but not all the way to either end because we already sewed the ends together before, and if we were to do that now, we'd be sewing too close to the zip. After this step, you can turn it out the right way through the neck hole, and this is the really satisfying part where you can see it all taking shape with the zip attached and it looking really nice with the lining on the inside. I top stitched along the zipper edge here, and I've changed to a red thread along the top and then a yellow thread for the bobbin, but I didn't sew this part here because it's blue and I don't think I'll need to change threads to top stitch it. I think that it's not going to get in the way because it's a lot thinner than the texture of this, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Next, I started working on the hood and the cuffs, but first I want to explain to you a little bit about the sizing of the hood for this pattern. After making this pattern, I realized that the hood is not coming quite as far forward as I would like it to. So next time if I were to make this again, I would cut the hood out in the same size, but I wouldn't use a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the whole thing. I would probably just use like a 1 centimeter or a 1/4 inch, or like I would make the seam allowance smaller just to try and make the hood just that little bit bigger so that it comes a bit further forward on his head. So with that in mind, next time if I were to do this again, I would just sew a smaller seam allowance here as I was going around the hood. So here I am sewing around the back of the hood that goes over your head, and I also did the cuffs at the same time, just sewing along the short edge to make them into a tube. Then you place one of the hood pieces right sides together with the other one and sew around that edge so that you're attaching both sides together, and then you flip it back over to top stitch over that part, which is the front part around your face. I then realized that I didn't chop the seam allowance, so I turned it back out and used my scissors to chop out the seam allowance, but I should have done that before I top stitched it. Moving on to the sleeves, I first needed to mark out the quarter points on the edge of the sleeve and then folding the cuff over on itself, marking the quarter points on that as well. And then you match the sleeves together so that the raw edge of the cuff band and the raw edge of the sleeve are matching each other. And then you need to stretch that as you're sewing it together so that it is the same tension the whole way around. Before I attach these sleeves, I'm going to quickly explain to you how I'm going to fix the problem of Elijah's sleeves being too short. These sleeves really are quite a bit too short for Elijah, so in order to fix that problem, I have made 2 new sleeves, which I'm going to be sewing on. I've made them probably about 5 centimeters longer than the pattern said, maybe even more than that. So I'm going to be cutting off the old sleeves and adding these ones on. And then with the old sleeves, the ones that are currently on there, I have made this jumper here for Ruben. So I'm going to be putting these small sleeves on here for Ruben, who is our 2-year-old, so that then the boys can have matching jumpers. This one though for Ruben, I have made it just a pull over your head type hoodie because I thought with the massive crow, there would be no way to have a whole one with a zip through it. It just wouldn't work. Yes, so I wanted to make it over his head. It would chop the crow off, wouldn't it? Yeah. Too much. I have filmed the process of making this pullover style hoodie, and I used the exact same pattern as I made this one for Elijah, just obviously a smaller size. So if you would like to see how to adapt the pattern from being a zipped hoodie to being a pull over your head hoodie. I'm going to be sharing a short about that next week. So I'd love for you to subscribe and come back to see the short next week of when I make this jumper here for Ruben so that you can see how to do that as well. So back to sewing the sleeve in place. First, I basted around the armhole, and then you place the sleeve right side together with the opening of the sleeve hole on the arm there, and you're going to pin that around really carefully. Then you need to sew it together on your sewing machine, again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and it looks like this. It's really starting to come together at this point, and we only have a few little steps left to go here. So the next step was to base stitch along the opening of the hood and a base stitching along the neckline as well of the main part of the jumper, so that it was easier to then clip both of those two sides together before sewing along that part as well, which attaches the hood to the jumper. The last step is to attach some bias tape along the edge where you've attached the hood to the jumper, just to make it look really nice and professional. So you open up your bias tape and you sew one edge of it along the seam that we have already created when we attach the hood, and then you cut down that seam allowance and fold the bias tape over so that it covers that seam, and you sew it down again, just top stitching on top of the bias tape. And you'll want to remember to change your bobbin to match the colour that's going to be shown on the front of the jumper. So this is what the finished jumper looks like, all ready to be worn, except I still need to change out the sleeves for this particular one, but technically it's all done. So there you have it. Thanks for joining me today as I show you how I have sewn this hoodie for Elijah. And if you have a go at making a hoodie like this, I would love to see a photo. You can tag me on Instagram at mymummakes.marie. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel to see some of our future videos. And until next time, go get creative, and we'll see you later.